Hey everybody, this is our video for the week. It is on crime and incarceration. Last week we did crime and deviance. Mostly deviance, right? We sort of looked at the lighter, less heavy side of deviance. This week is a little heavier, right? The subject matter is just a little more serious in terms of consequences that we see in our communities and in our society in general. So, we're gonna forge on. I do have a couple of quick course announcements to make, and these are reflected in our announcements in Blackboard. But course evaluations are open, so this is your chance to let me know, let my bosses know, let everybody know how you feel each of your courses is going. So make sure you fill those out. Do it for all of your classes. Including this one, but I'll post the link. I have posted the link in the announcements that gives you all the information on filling that out for our class. So please take care of that as soon as you can, and do it for all your classes. I encourage you to make sure you give us some feedback, because the students and how they feel the class is going and what they feel they're learning in the class is important to us as instructors. It's important to the college as a whole. So there's my spiel on that. Hopefully by the time most of you are seeing this, I'll have all your grades caught up. I'll have them all caught up by the end of the day on Wednesday. I've got everything taken care of. Other than that, tomorrow basically all I'm doing, I've got one class, and other than that, all I'm doing is getting all your grades caught up for this class, so you know where you stand, because we do have the withdrawal date coming up in just a few weeks, so I want you all to know where you stand in the class. That's important. Okay, those things I said, they're out of the way. So let's get on to our course content for the week. And to give you a little background on why I'm so interested in this topic, and my last job before moving over here and then working at Beaufort was in rural Tennessee. I worked with a prisoner reentry program at a county jail in Tennessee. And it just has affected my perspective on things. So I worked directly with inmates on what we call a reentry program. We'll talk more about what a reentry program is and what it hopes to accomplish. And we'll also see that the criminal justice reform is one of the few areas, one of the only areas in today's political landscape that really truly has bipartisan support, right? Everybody kind of agrees that there are some problems with our criminal justice system that we need to address. There's some maybe differences of opinion on how to address them, but everybody kind of agrees that we got to do something. There's something not working right. But that's my background. I used to work in a jail. I was doing a sort of a program evaluation of a reentry program, and measuring recidivism. So I've got a little bit of first-hand knowledge on this, particularly in terms of what offender reentry looks like in rural America. So we'll talk about that. We had a reading on rural incarceration and some of the things that are driving that number. So I like this. I really like where we're going with the rest of the semester. The first half of the semester is a lot of, I think, more sort of abstract sociology. We learn the theories, and we learn some of the more general ideas of institutions and groups, and those things are very important, and those are the things that you're most expected to learn in a sociology class. Now we get to have a little bit more freedom, I think, to focus on what matters and focus on some more concrete issues that we see in our day-to-day lives. So I'm excited about the rest of the semester and where we're going to get to go from here. And we're going in at a pretty interesting place, and I think where a lot of us have some interest. So let's jump right into it. Let's go a little further. So I titled our Crime and Deviance Part 2, Crime and Punishment. That's because I'd like to amuse myself. But crime and punishment, crime and incarceration, we're going to talk a little bit about what all that is. But let's review real quick the relationship between criminality and deviance. Is that most criminal behavior is deviant, and there are very few actions that are criminal but not deviant. All sorts of stuff is deviant but not criminal. But we're focusing right here on the criminal stuff this week. Now, in your deviance projects that you're working on, that is due March 22nd, you're focusing more on sort of what I like to consider the lighter side of deviance, but it's still really important, right? So we've got two types of norms that we're worried about, formal and informal norms. And so in our projects, in our deviance projects, we're focused on the informal norms, right? And how those informal norms are enforced. And again, the way our informal norms are enforced is going to be far more nuanced. It's going to come in a lot of different forms. It could be way more subtle, or it could come in terms of just polite correction or awkwardness, or just a certain feeling of discomfort that makes you not want to repeat that behavior. Formal norms, however, have formal enforcement, right? So when you're and again, remember our difference between formal norms and informal norms. Formal norms are codified. They are written down somewhere. They are documented. That's the key idea with formal norms. There is documentation that you can point to, that you can look at, that says you are not supposed to do these things. It's written, and there are consequences that are codified, that are written into code for violating these norms. So not all formal norms translate to crime, right? We talk about the example of academic dishonesty, like that's clearly a formal norm that is written into a code. It is documented. You can go to the policies and procedures for any college or any high school, any place of learning, and you can see that there are consequences for academic dishonesty, and they define academic dishonesty as directly as they can, as specifically as they can. So in terms of crime, we're talking about behavior that violates a law, right? So it's codified specifically by a government entity, some sort of lawmaking body or a legislative body. It can come so that government entity can be at the county level, the city level, the state level, or the national level. But some way, shape, or form, when you're committing a crime, you are violating a law that has been written by some sort of government body, at least in the United States anyway. So that was a smooth edit. I know I almost jumped the gun to incarceration. Incarceration is just one of the ways that we respond and we enforce our formal norms that are codified in the law. So there are other ways, right? We do have probation, we have parole, we have these diversion programs that we'll talk a little bit more about in just a minute. But the thing that comes to mind most often when you talk about violating the law is that we kind of default to this idea of incarceration. So incarceration is defined as being put in a jail or prison. So we call it incarceration instead of imprisonment because jails are different from prisons. And remember, I wrote a little note about that before our reading, and I hope that kind of came through in the reading, that jails are a little bit different from prisons. Jails are generally designed for more short-term stays. Prisons are for people who have already been convicted and are serving longer sentences. Generally, there's always exceptions. And in our reading, right, we learned that there are rural county jails that hold people for the state or for another county, and they may serve longer sentences at the jail, at the county jail, than 1 year, but they're usually not going to be a county defendant or a county offender or a misdemeanor offender, but they are going to be a state or felony offender that is being held for that other body. If that makes any sense. I'm getting bogged down in the details here. Let's talk about the reasons why we incarcerate and what we hope to accomplish from incarceration. And there are 4 key schools of thought on this, and we had a reading that went over all this, so I just want to review it real quick. Retribution is the first idea, is that there's some sort of morality to it. It's punishment for punishment's sake. It's just because it's somehow it's the right thing to do. And that's something that I think has become structurated, to use a nice sociological term. Incarceration has become such an ingrained social structure, such an institution, that we don't really question the whys of it anymore. It just feels right. When someone does something wrong, when someone violates the law, when someone hurts somebody else, we feel like they need to pay the price for it. They need to do the time for the crime. And it's just such a habitual, ritualized practice that we don't really question it that much, right? This idea about why do we incarcerate, there's a good chance that many of us have never even considered that question anymore. We incarcerate because it's what you do when someone breaks the law. It's what you have to do. It's the best thing we got. But there are other philosophies there, right? And this is one that comes up a lot, is the idea of deterrence, right? And the idea behind deterrence is the 3 S's, which aren't actually 3 S's, but swift, severe, and certain. I know certain doesn't begin with an S, but it alliterates. Swift, severe, certain. As long as the punishment is swift, severe, and certain, it will effectively deter people from committing that crime in the future, or from other people who see someone go to jail or prison from committing a similar act. So that's the idea of deterrence, is to deter, prevent people from committing those crimes in the future. Incapacitation is the idea that you're just going to lock dangerous people away from the rest of society. That, this person just can't be trusted out in the world, so they have to go to a confined space to protect the rest of the world. And then rehabilitation. And rehabilitation is the idea that you want to change the behavior of an offender. You want to affect the change in that behavior. And that's really important, right? Because in the United States, and the way our laws are set up, the way our Constitution is set up, most people are going to get out of jail. Most people who are incarcerated will eventually be released, like about 99%, right? We don't lock people up for life for petty crimes, right? And the vast majority of the crimes that we see committed and resulting in arrest are petty crimes, aren't serious crimes. They're not murder. They're not anything so severe that you would consider a life punishment. But so you've got to deal with the reality that eventually the vast majority of our prison and jail populations will at some point no longer be in those prisons or jails. So the idea that it's important to, at some point in that process, rehabilitate, so that when the folks get out of their period of incarceration, when they're back in the world, hopefully they'll have more tools to succeed. And we'll talk more about that in a second. First, we gotta talk about the dark side of this. There are other reasons to keep people incarcerated, and a lot of people will argue. A lot of people will argue that keeping people in jails or prisons is good for business, and it is. I mean, that's not really a debatable fact, right? A lot of people make a lot of money from the incarceration system and from our booming prison population. Now, whether or not that is something that drives prison population and drives our habits of incarceration is a little more debatable. But there's some good evidence to indicate that it's that one of the factors that has driven our increasing prison populations over the past 30 years is the commodification of prisoners, right? We call it the prison industrial complex, and we'll get to that in a second. That's a little preview. But how important is it to consider who we are putting in jail and which communities they come from? There's something called the law of crime concentration. That's the idea that especially in urban areas, most of the crime is being committed in a small neighborhood, or most of the arrests are being made. I shouldn't say most of the crime is being committed. Most of the arrests that are being made and most of the people who are being incarcerated are coming from like one single concentrated area, right? In most cities, the general rule that 50% of arrests occur in a neighborhood where about 4% of the population lives. and of course that varies from city to city, but it's a good general pattern that we see existing in cities throughout. So when we consider the demographics of those communities and so which sort of ethnic groups are being affected the most, and they are Black and brown people, particularly African Americans and Latin Americans. Those communities are being affected the most by the booming prison population and the absence of fathers, the absence of family members, the absence of income. All of that matters, and all of that affects the way those communities are made up. And we've got some videos that are going to help us get a handle on that. In fact, before we go on to mass incarceration per se, let's look at one of those videos. This video comes from a show called Adam Ruins Everything. It's on True TV. It's a useful clip. The show can be a little bit obnoxious sometimes, but just to maybe take a moment of lightheartedness while we're dealing with such a serious kind of issue. That's worthwhile. So there's a lot of truth here. Again, with TV shows like this, I always recommend you keep your sort of cynical, skeptical antennae up. But this one, it's worth viewing and it's worth talking about. So let's go ahead and take a look at it.
Adam, you got me into this? No, you get me out.
I promise, I have someone working on it. But in the meantime, this is a great opportunity to explain why our nation's prison system is a failure on every level.
So you know a lot about prison? I bet you watch a lot of PBS documentaries, huh?
I guess you're right, I do lack first-hand knowledge. Oh, maybe you can help me do this episode?
Sure. Nothing better to do.
Whoa, do you have magic TV powers like Adam?
Nope. But I got a lot of favors.
Early lunch today, everyone.
America's prison system is a total mess. Whatever purpose you think it serves, it ain't doing it.
Well, the point of prison is to reduce crime.
It's definitely not doing that. There are 2.2 million people incarcerated in the U.S., 10 times more than 50 years ago.
2 million is more than the population of some states.
Welcome to mass incarceration, Massachusetts. Our primary export, shiz. Our secondary export, God.
Hey, that's contraband.
But despite this massive increase in the prison population, a study conducted by the NYU School of Law found that the effect on the crime rate has been essentially zero.
Zero? Then why do we lock so many people up?
Just to cut in real quick there, so that study from the NYU School of Law that they referenced that said the effect of mass incarceration on crime rates was at about zero is a different study than the one we read. And that's one of the things that I want us as students, as people who are studying these kinds of things in a formal way, when we see something like that, I want us to feel confident enough and comfortable enough with our own understanding and our own abilities to go in and look at that research, to not just say, oh, well, that study said that. Well, that's one study. It's corroborated by other studies we can find out, and we can actually look at the data. We can look at the way they collected the data, and we can analyze it and come to our own conclusions about that. And we can be responsible consumers of information in that way. Okay, that's my soapbox for that.
Well, I can't speak for all prisons, but this one is here to make money.
Make money? You mean someone is profiting from all this?
Yep, these guys are.
It all started in the tough-on-crime 80s, when the war on drugs meant state and federal prisons were bursting at the seams.
So many prisoners, what do we do?
Let corporate America handle your prisons. We'll take care of everything. Save you a few bucks and skim a little off the top.
But businesses running prisons? That sounds a little fishy. Just kidding. I mean, hey, if it saves money, right?
And so the Corrections Corporation of America, or CCA, was born.
Okay, hold on. You can't just sell prisons like they're cars or real estate or hamburgers.
Now, why don't you tell that to Tom Beasley, the co-founder of CCA, who once said you just sell prisons like you were selling cars or real estate or hamburgers?
I'll have a number 7 with extra solitary cells, electric fence, and
small onion ring.
Got your Supermax on?
Yeah, Supermax said. And they rake in a ton of scratch. Last year, CCA took in $1.7 billion.
Business is so good, it's criminal.
Well, you know, maybe it's okay because they're saving the taxpayer money.
Sorry, the sales pitch was wrong. The data shows that private prisons cost the taxpayers just as much as regular prisons.
And today, nearly 1/5 of federal prisoners are held in a for-profit facility.
Look at
Graffiti. That's an infraction. A beautiful one. Are you Banksy?
Oh my gosh, I already got an infraction? I must give it a lot of these.
Oh yeah, that's not a coincidence.
one study showed that private prisons dole out twice as many infractions as government prisons.
Not having enough infractions. That's an infraction.
These penalties can lengthen your sentence, which earns the company even more cash.
Oh, so the more people that are in prison, the more money they make. Ooh, that's dirty.
Yep, that's why private prisons sneak occupancy clauses into their contracts, which actually require states to keep prisons full.
Last year, a private prison in Arizona didn't make their 97% capacity quota. So the state government had to pay them a $3 million fine.
Fines like that incentivize cash-strapped states to keep people in prison as long as possible.
Your parole forms are in order, and you've been a model prisoner. So we're going to lock you back up. We really can't afford to pay another fine.
That's reprehensible.
Look, not all prisons are private prisons, but this one is. So no, its purpose isn't to stop crime.
It's the dollar bills, y'all.
Can't believe all this has been happening and I didn't even know. I mean, I've never thought about prison like at all.
Hey, pulling back the curtain on our disturbing business practices, that's an infraction. Hey, that makes 3 infractions. You're gonna go to solitary.
Okay, that doesn't sound so bad, you know, peace and quiet, do some meditation.
No, solitary confinement is a cruel and inhumane punishment that has no place in modern society.
Wait, what?
We'll tell you about it after you get settled in the hole.
No, tell me that!
Test. All right. So I think that was kind of a fun clip, taking a fun take on a serious issue. And parts of it don't necessarily belong in a classroom. I don't need one of the characters in the show telling us that it's reprehensible. We can make our own, value judgments on it. In a classroom like this, when we're kind of just looking at the science of it, we're not looking at what is right and what is wrong about something. We are looking at what is. We all have opinions. We all have beliefs and values, and that's okay. We should, right? We should be people who have values and have opinions. But in a classroom setting, we're not necessarily looking to advance an opinion or make value judgments. We are just trying to look at the reality of the situation. And so the reality of that situation is there are private prisons and they are driven by profit and not by, the betterment of society. So it's a balancing act, right? Always a balancing act. But these private prison companies aren't the only companies that profit off what we call the prison industrial complex or mass incarceration. I'm going to give you another video, and again, this video goes a little bit on the extreme, and it's a little bit almost hyperbolic, but it's real. It's a real thing. So a lot of services, even in public prisons and jails, or even in jails that are run by a county or a state or federal government entity, which most of them are, a lot of the services within those jails are outsourced and they're run by a private company. So it's a different company that is going to make money off of the commissary, off people buying the things, the food items and the various and sundry things that you need. If you need an extra pillow, if you need an extra blanket, if you just want a bag of chips instead of whatever they're serving in the jail or in the prison, there's something called commissary. And there are companies that provide those items, and they make a lot of money off of that system. And of course, the more people who are in jail or who are incarcerated, the more money they make. And then there are also most jails and most prisons outsource their health care. And we're going to watch a video on that right now about a company that runs healthcare for a lot of detention centers.
Guess what corporation makes an estimated $1.4 billion a year off sick prisoners? Meet Corizon, the country's largest prison healthcare company. Corizon treats more than 300,000 prisoners nationwide. The word treats is used loosely.
Son is incarcerated in the Arizona Department of Corrections in Tucson, contracted hepatitis C. It is damaging his liver and eventually will do the cirrhosis of the liver, go into liver cancer, and will kill him eventually if not treated. He is treatable and curable, but not receiving the proper treatment.
My partner, Thomas Vogt, and he's been incarcerated here in Tucson, Arizona since 1994. He has an enlarged prostate, and there's also a growth there that needs a biopsy. Hello? We're talking about you. Did you get your pain meds yet?
No. I'm in constant pain. I can't even sit now. They just ignore it.
I cannot tell you how many of the same kinds of stories we hear on a daily, weekly basis. This is what we call malpractice in the medical field.
We save money because we skip the ambulance and bring them right to the morgue. Diane Jackson, nurse at Corizon. In fact, they save so much money, they can pay their CEO nearly $1 million.
We are the industry pioneers. We are the innovators. Our team is unmatched in knowledge and passion.
6 employees have resigned after 2 inmates at Metro Corrections here in Louisville died this year.
Now, those employees are not corrections officers, but workers with Corizon, Louisville's jail healthcare contractor.
There's no question that Corizon is profiteering from mass incarceration in this country.
My son's being told they have no protocol for treating anybody with hepatitis C, so they don't have permission to even give them medicine to prevent the hepatitis C.
There are no medical services being provided, in my opinion.
Corizon's getting taxpayer money in 29 states, and they're vying for more.
The profit motive is inherently at odds with the mission of a correctional institution. There will always be a perverse incentive not to rehabilitate, not to treat.
They need help, and we can't help them. The only thing we can do is fight for them.
All right, and so again, that video, again, it's not a super impartial look at it, but in some ways, it's hard to be when you look at the reality of the situation. Again, prison, jail, it's not a place that you're supposed to want to go. But at the same time, we have to deal with the fact that the vast majority, again, almost 99% of our incarcerated population will at some point no longer be incarcerated. And that's just a reality that we have to deal with. And again, we've got some agreement. One of the few things that we have agreement on in the country and within our political system is that we need to focus on criminal justice reform and put more of an emphasis on rehabilitation and treatment. So let's look back at our PowerPoint real quick because there's a couple of other things on this in our site, in our Blackboard site. So we've got this term of the prison industrial complex and how that's linked to mass incarceration. And that comes from a very conflict theory perspective, but the idea that when you're taking things and you're turning human beings and human interaction into a commodity that people make money off of, that's a very conflict theory kind of perspective. So the prison industrial complex comes from that perspective, but it's the idea that incarceration has become a commodity, has become a thing that is bought and sold, and there are some repercussions from that. Mass incarceration has decimated communities, particularly African American communities. And one of the things about a sociology course like this is that so many of our issues that we're going to talk about, they sort of come back to some general themes. They come back to race. They come back to social class. They come back to gender often. Again, and I'm not even mentioning the gender aspect of this. Mass incarceration particularly affects men, right? It's young black men. Those are the vast majority of our, not the vast majority, but they are vastly disproportionately imprisoned in our country. And so when you look at the realities of mass incarceration, it's hard to disentangle that issue from issues of race and gender and masculinity. But we have to, because of the way the course is laid out. So we're going to kind of put a pin in our discussion of race and gender and the mass incarceration and the prison industrial complex. But I do want to hear what you think about it and get your responses on it. So we do have the extra credit opportunity. There is 13. There's a documentary on Netflix. Only one of you, there's just one person in this class that I know of, was in attendance at the screening we did for 13th on campus. And I didn't get to speak to you there, Niger. Speaking to Niger, I didn't get to speak to you there, but I saw your name on the sign-in sheet. So thank you for being there. But anyway, if you missed that, you can still watch the documentary on Netflix and just submit a little write-up of your thoughts. And I got more details in the extra credit folder that's on Blackboard. And then we also have a discussion board for the week that is going to touch on this idea. And again, there's going to be a couple of videos to watch and to respond to, but they're going to be short, right? The Netflix documentary 13th, that's about 2 hours, almost 2 hours worth of documentary. So it's a little bit more of a time commitment than I want to put on just a discussion board. But it's a good overlook. So anyway, that's what our discussion board is on. It's on mass incarceration and the race issues and the gender issues that are unavoidable when you're looking at the reality of the situation and who is being incarcerated at such high rates. And you know what? Yep, there are also issues of class and poverty, right? So all of these, nothing exists in a vacuum, of course, in a sociology class. So all of those things are fair game. Anything you want to talk about. But in the coming weeks, we'll talk more about social class when we talk about social stratification, and we'll talk more about race and gender. And that's where we're headed with the rest of the class. So before we move on, I want to talk a little bit more about the technical side of things, and give you one more word that you're going to hear a lot about if you are just a responsible consumer of news and information. You're going to hear about this term, recidivism. Recidivism is just how often people relapse into criminal behavior after becoming justice involved, right? It's the rate at which people go back into the system, if you will. So it's tougher to measure than it should be, than you would think it would be. At the state level, it's pretty easy to know when someone is released from a prison, when they're released from a state or federal prison, and if they return to a state or federal prison, that's pretty easy. But depending on how you're defining recidivism, some definitions of recidivism, again, this definition says relapse into criminal behavior. And that's really tough, right? I mean, you can't just go and poll everybody who's ever been to jail and say, hey, have you been going back into any criminal behavior? You're not likely to get a real reliable response. So we generally measure it in terms of rearrest. But then how long after release, right? So incarceration rates after 1 year, after 3 years, after 9 years, they're going to be pretty different, right? We saw the one study where after 9 years, one study found that 83% of the people they studied were reincarcerated 9 years, or had been reincarcerated within 9 years of their initial release. 83%, right? There it is. And again, that's just a sample, right? You can't ask everybody. So who all was included, and does arrest equal conviction? What were the result of those arrests? How many of those were reincarcerated after their arrest? Were they arrested on parole violations? Because that's that's a difficult thing to track, right? Because if you are on parole or probation or on community corrections, which is another level of sort of deferred prosecution, they call it, you can be violated. You can get a parole violation for getting fired from work or being late to your halfway house, being late, missing your curfew at your halfway house. All of those things can end up putting you back into prison or into jail. You can become incarcerated again. And the other thing, when I worked at my rural county in Tennessee, I was trying to measure recidivism at the county jail level, which is just near impossible. It's just near impossible because the vast majority of the jail population, which we read about in the reading on rural jails, the vast majority of the jail population hasn't been convicted of anything. They're in their awaiting trial, what we call pre-trial detainment, either because the judge has denied bail or because they can't afford bail. So, I had people who were in my program and my reentry program who were in the program for 6-7 months, and then, worked out a deal and they were done. They served their sentence. They got time served, or in one case, they were actually, the charges against them were dropped. So this person was, in jail for 6-7 months and ended up never being convicted of anything. So these things, so anyway, how do you measure that person's recidivism, right? Because they served a period of incarceration, but do they count as a recidivist if they are arrested again? Again, I'm not sure. So measuring recidivism is really tricky. So when you look at rates of recidivism, it's really important to look at the methodology, how they're measuring it, what they're actually measuring. Again, it's a good measure. It's a good thing to keep track of. It's a great idea. But again, when you're looking at these reports, I encourage you to be a responsible consumer of that information. So recidivism cycles, and again, getting the hard numbers is going to be tricky, but we do know that it exists, right? We do know that people, after they are convicted of a crime and serve a period of incarceration, we know they often end up going back into the system, going back into jail or prison. And so recidivism cycles happen in all sorts of different ways. But there are efforts to, having a criminal record makes it tough to get a job. Having a felony record means you aren't eligible for public housing, right? You can't stay in a housing project with a felony on your record most of the time. So everything gets a little more difficult and tricky for you when you get out of jail. In Tennessee, where I worked, they don't let you get your license back. You will have your license revoked until you've paid all of your fines and fees, until you've paid restitution. But in a rural area like that, it's really hard to get to work if you don't have a license, if you don't have a car. So what happens is people are driving, they'll find a job, and they'll drive to work every day without a license while they're on probation or on parole, because they got to work. They got to have a job. It's one of the terms of their probation. And then moreover, they need money to pay back these fines and fees so they can get their license back. And then, they get pulled over on the way to work. And again, it's a small county. All the deputies know them. Everybody knows everybody. And the deputy says, "Well, there's Zach Meeks driving a car. I know Zach Meeks, doesn't have a license because it's a small county, and I know he just got out and he hadn't paid all his restitution." So you pick him up, you charge him with driving without a license, and he's back in jail. That's just one example of a cycle of recidivism, right? Once you're incarcerated one time, a lot of times it's hard to stay out. You'll hear, well, I don't know if you'll hear it, but there's a concept of going flat time. And that's where you actually increase the length of your sentence, or you decrease the length of your sentence by staying in the incarceration phase a little bit longer. So you stay in jail a little bit longer. So that way, when you stay in jail or prison, stay incarcerated for a little bit longer. But that way, when you get out, you're not on paper, as they say. You're not on parole or probation. and that way, you're not going to go back to jail for the tiniest little violation, I should say, not violation. I could talk about it all day. I could talk about it all day. I worked in that jail and I enjoyed the work, and anyway, I gotta stop. I'm rambling here. So I've got one last video clip to show you, and it's just about a 2-minute clip, and just to demonstrate that this is an issue that does have kind of broad support from all sides, politically speaking. This is where we're at, and some of the ways that we, as a society, as a government, as a culture, the way things, what we're sort of moving toward when we're faced with the realities of mass incarceration and the deteriorating effects it's having on our communities, particularly our communities of color. So here's another little clip.
President Trump today signed a sweeping criminal justice overhaul, which had rare bipartisan support. It shortens some drug sentences and expands rehabilitation programs for prisoners. As Jim Axelrod reports, it is all about second chances.
After 6.5 years in federal prison for selling drugs, Rosa Concha now helps recently released felons transition.
Don't get discouraged. One interview might not go well, but we'll keep pushing.
At the Exodus Transitional Community in New York City, helping launch post-prison lives with job searches and counseling.
What we do is keep people from going back to prison.
What is our resume for? Julio Medina runs the agency.
We cannot continue to characterize people as Americans by the worst moment of their lives.
It's not just the boost in funding his agency is expected to get from the new law, it's the sweeping change in how we punish. Thousands of well-behaved inmates getting early releases, others seeing their sentences reduced, and drug offenders getting treatment.
For the longest time, we've thought we should lock as many people up as we can for as long as we can and do nothing with them while they're gone. And somehow that would make us safer.
If Kevin Ring sounds like just another liberal, well, he's not. He's a former Republican congressional aide turned lobbyist who did 1.5 years in prison for corruption and wire fraud.
While I was there, I saw people who had made mistakes, deserved a second chance, but while they were in prison, they were getting no rehabilitation, no programming.
Ring, who now runs a sentencing reform nonprofit that pushed for the law, says the bipartisan support rests on one fact. 113 million Americans know a family member who's been incarcerated.
This is a problem that we thought that was confined maybe to some communities, but it's affecting a lot of communities.
The law the president signed today covers only federal prisoners, roughly 9% of the nation's inmates. Large-scale reform will be a matter of change at the state and local level.
Yeah, such an interesting story. It makes you think.
All right, so that's the state of legislation as it is right now. So that the legislation that the president signed, again, only affects 9% of our incarcerated population in the United States. But it shows that there's political will to address some of the issues we're talking about. So that's about the best I can do to put some positive spin on that. But when we talk about the realities of that and what it looks like, we're talking about what our readings termed diversion programs. And that's where you're literally diverting people away from incarceration towards other sort of supervised sentences. So probation, parole, community corrections, just resources, programs like that for nonviolent offenders and offenders who show that they're not a danger to the people around them or to themselves. The tricky part about that is it's never going to be perfect, right? But anyway, so that's your vote. That's your one last vocab word for this chapter is diversion programs. And again, the root word there is divert, and you're just looking at programs to keep people away out of jail and more into programs that'll help them, whether it's addiction treatment that they need, if it's mental health treatment that they need, if it's an education program, whatever it may be, you're diverting people into services that are already existing that can hopefully benefit them more than incarceration, and benefit society more than incarceration, right? I mean, we'd much rather have somebody in a job, paying taxes, doing what they're supposed to do, instead of being in jail or a prison. So that's the spiel. That's where we are. The one last thing I want to show you is just this is just me being me. I want to show you pictures of my reentry program that we started in Grundy County, Tennessee. We have GED class. There's a guy getting his GED. We even did an art class. And there's a good amount of literature that shows creative endeavors. Like we did a writing class, we did an art class. Those sorts of programs sort of increase an individual's agency. You remember back in the very beginning of our class, right? In the first video we did, we talked about that difference between agency and structure. Reentry programs are designed to increase individual agency. Education is a big one of those. Let me restate what agency is. Agency is the ability to navigate social structures, right? So we talked about how agency versus structure, and there's that kind of debate. It's kind of a silly debate because there's clearly both, right? There are social structures that influence our actions and influence our behavior. But we also have varying amounts of agency or an ability to navigate those structures in the most effective ways for our own purposes. So reentry programs are designed to hopefully increase individual agency. So there's a good body of literature that shows things like art, writing, gardening programs are actually shown to be really successful. But hands down, the most effective, statistically speaking, the most effective way to reduce recidivism is to increase education and education opportunities. So, this was a picture I posted at the beginning of our chapter, at the beginning of our week in Blackboard. That's me over there. With this is my first cohort of program participants. And I've kept up with some of them, but I won't point out which ones, but there's a couple that I know are have been already rearrested. It's been 2 years since I've left there, and there's a couple of those guys that are already back in jail. But then there's a couple that are doing well. Anyway, nothing's perfect, never perfect, but anyway. That's where we are. That's our chapter on crime and punishment and incarceration and the shifting landscape there. Let me know if you got any questions. I'll be happy to help. Last things for housekeeping, we got, again, our deviance project. Again, that's the lighter side of deviance. We're looking at sort of how informal norms are enforced. And extra credit opportunities. There is one so far, and that's that 13th documentary that's on Netflix. If you don't have access to Netflix, let me know, and we'll work out an alternative. And finally, course evaluations. Course evaluations are open, and all that information is posted in an announcement on Blackboard. So take care of that for not just our class, but for all of your Beaufort classes. Those are important. All right. That is it for the week. See you next week.